Este es un contenido de Uninorte Académico. Suscríbete, aprende y comparte.
Se siente más confortable en inglés, tendremos unas palabras y también unas preguntas iniciales de nuestro decano, el profesor Julián Arellana, quien también es un experto en transporte. Y por supuesto también habrá apertura a una sesión de preguntas por parte del público. Queremos que esta sea una jornada participativa, así que atiendan con sumo cuidado la presentación del profesor Jesper. Al final de su presentación, repito, tendremos la posibilidad de realizar preguntas por parte de todos los asistentes. Jesper, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. And please, the audience is yours.
Vale, muchas gracias. Y muchas gracias a todos para venir. Como Víctor dijo, hablo español, pero no tan perfecto, entonces voy a cambiar a inglés para la presentación porque sí, hay muchas palabras que no conozco en español. Entonces, pero sí, la presentación, el primer slide está en español, pero ya. Solo para presentarme un poquito más, soy Jesper Blåfors-Ingvarsson, soy profesor en la división de transporte en la Universidad Politécnica de Dinamarca. Y sí, hice mi bachelor, mi máster, mi doctorado allá, enfocado en transporte público y también en bicis, y por eso llevé 2 fotos de mí en bici en Bogotá a la izquierda y en Copenhague a la derecha. Vale. Estoy más enfocado en transporte público, pero también en bicicletas y el comportamiento de los pasajeros y la gente en el transporte. Pero sí, voy a cambiar a inglés porque es más cómodo para mí. First, just to give a setting of the presentation, so we are now in Barranquilla, and I'm talking about Copenhagen, so I just want to make a brief comparison between some of the key figures that are related to my talk today, looking into Copenhagen and to the Barranquilla area. So comparing the two cities, Copenhagen is the capital of Denmark, Barranquilla is not the largest city of Colombia, but it's actually like almost double the size as Copenhagen, both if you look into the population in the city area and also in the metropolitan area. It's also a much more dense city than Copenhagen, both in the city and especially in the city area where it's very dense Barranquilla, as you can also see on the photo, whereas in Copenhagen we only have buildings of the size of 5 floors. It's governed by the land use regulations, so no buildings can be more than 5 stories tall, and that means that we have a much lower population density and employment density and so on in Copenhagen. But on the other hand, we have a quite dense public transport network. Depends on how you define the city sizes and city areas and the boundaries, but we have more than 130 stations in the metro and the suburban rail network. We also have local trains and so on, and more than 200 kilometers in total covering the greater Copenhagen area. In Barranquilla, not so many trains, despite the big size of the city. In terms of bicycling, this is only for the Copenhagen city center. We have almost 400 kilometers of bicycle network in a very, very small area. So basically all streets have a bicycle lane. And in the greater Copenhagen area, I don't have a figure, but it has to be more than 1,000 kilometers because it's very, very dense in terms of bicycle infrastructure. And what I could find in Barranquilla is that you have 63 kilometers last year. So again, a little bit on the lower side than compared to Copenhagen. Just a brief introduction to some of the mode shares. So I took Copenhagen on the side, on the right, and some of the 3 cities in Colombia. And it's a bit difficult to compare these one to one because in Denmark we basically only have walking, bicycling, public transport, and cars. And in Colombia you have a mix of motos and autos, and you have informal public transport and more proper public transport. So it's a bit difficult to compare. But what I wanted to show here is that public transport, even though the network might not be as good as in Copenhagen, you have way more public transport than we have in Denmark. You have around like 1/3 of the trips being conducted in public transport, and we have only like 10-15% depending on where you define the line of the city boundary. On the other hand, we have lots of bicycle traffic. and you don't have that much. Some of these figures are a bit old. I know now that Bogota is around 10% now, which is increasing a lot. But it's still Copenhagen and Denmark in general, a big bicycle country. Yeah, these are just the trends over the years in terms of mode shares, because it depends on how you define the city, how much traffic we have of bicycling and public transport. This is in Denmark, mostly car traffic, especially in the rural areas. Public transport only around 7%. Bicycle traffic around 15% on the global scale in Denmark. And then if you zoom into the city, we get a higher percentage of public transport and also walking and bicycle transport, public transport, and walking. And especially if you look into this city center of Copenhagen, we have around 20% of public transport. Yeah. Okay. Just a brief introduction to the public transport network, and then I'll go into talking mostly about bicycling afterwards. This is the network we have in Denmark. We have Denmark on the left, and we have railways covering the entire Danish area, so to speak, at least. So you can travel by public transport, getting from anywhere to almost anywhere, which is quite nice. Of course, some of the rural areas are not that much connected in the rail infrastructure, but yeah. On the right-hand side, we have Copenhagen, and we have the metro in the city, and then we have all these lines going out from the city. I'll come back to that later, connecting all the suburbs to the dense city area. So many people live within walking distance, or at least biking distance, to a train station. This is how it looks in Copenhagen. We have the S trains, the red ones, which are bigger and covering larger distances, carrying more passengers at a higher speed. And then we have the metro, which is the upper right one, only serving the dense city center area, mostly below ground, but also some parts above ground. And then we also have buses, of course. So that was just to give a brief introduction on how it looks in Denmark. Yeah, and one more thing is that we're building a light rail. So this is the Copenhagen area. We have the radial lines going out. Do I have a... So we have the radial lines going out of the city here and up north. And then now we have like a line of light rail that will cover the suburbs, and so people can get across the city as well. And that's actually opening just now. Yeah. But what I will focus mostly on in this presentation is about cycling. So cycling in Denmark is a somewhat big thing. Most people own a bike. And actually, most people that own a bike, they own more than one bike. I myself have 2 bikes. I have colleagues that have 3 and 4 bikes for different types of purposes. Going long distance, going short distance, going to the city where they're afraid of having the bike being robbed by someone. So yeah, most people bike, and it's both males and females. It's all genders, and it's all age groups. So both, of course, kids and young people are more biking than elderly relatively, but you see on the Danish bicycle path that you have people of all ages biking around. So it is part of a normal transport mode that everybody uses in Denmark. We use it for many different trip purposes, both for commuting, of course, going to work, going to school, going to university. That's a big part of the bicycle trips in Copenhagen, but you also use it for leisure trips if you want to go into the city, to a bar, to a restaurant, to a theater, to a movie or something like that, and also to errands, visit friends and family and so on. Most people, of course, use ordinary bikes, but we have seen a large increase in electric bikes in Denmark, especially covering long distances. And we also have lots of cargo bikes in the city center where people that don't have a car, they use the cargo bikes for going to buy like big stuff at the supermarket or other retail stores, but also to bring their kids back and forth for kindergartens and schools and so on. So that's a big increase as well. The shares of cycling in Denmark, this is covering like the 4 biggest cities. Copenhagen and Frederiksberg is the capital region, where it constitutes almost 1/3 of the amount of trips. And in that area, basically every second trip to work, half the people, they use biking for their commuting because it's very easy and like the infrastructure and so on. In the other cities, Aarhus, Odense, and Aalborg, which are the 3 other main cities in Denmark, it's also a quite large share. Yeah. So this is how it looks, and I think this is quite important that we have very good bicycle infrastructure in Denmark, both in the city center, where we have, for example, the bridge to the upper right, which is one of the widest bicycle lanes we have in Copenhagen now. It was car traffic was cancelled on this street, and they widened the bicycle path because there was way more bicycles crossing the bridge than cars before. So now they have the priority. As you can also see here, there are lots of people biking like all day. And also we have segregated lanes. The bottom left is one of the bicycle paths in Copenhagen that goes through like a more naturey areas. So it's connecting different neighborhoods, but going through a more green area to make it more pleasant for the bicyclists, and then giving them priority when they have to cross traffic. And this is another example of a project where we, a bridge that was before mostly for cars, the one down to the bottom left, now half the bridge is only for bicyclists. And that had some challenges for how to organize the traffic in the signal that leads up to the bridge. But now again, giving priorities to bicyclists, as you can see on the, mostly on the bottom right, where all the bicycles, they cross the intersection with their own dedicated right of way. This is more easier to see here that all the bicycles are using the left part of the bridge and the cars are on the right. So the bicyclists actually have more room than the cars in this part. And this is a very heavy corridor, and that's why they made it like this, because it's crossing two different large neighborhoods in Denmark, crossing the harbor area. So we also have these dedicated bicycle bridges. The one to the bottom left here is the connection. So looking at this, if you cross the bridge here and goes to the upper right in the photo, then you will arrive to this bridge at the bottom left that crosses the harbor. So that's a bicycle bridge, and it's used by more than 20,000 bicyclists every day. And again, just some examples. We have in Copenhagen 24 bridges that are only for bicyclists and pedestrians. Here are 4 of them. And the one to the bottom right, if you know something about Copenhagen, you can see the Nyhavn, the new harbor, which is a very touristy attraction in Denmark. And you have this bicycle bridge that leads from Nyhavn to the other side of the harbor, where we have like a big area for street food and going out for bars and stuff like that. So many people walk here and bike there to catch up with friends and so on. And this is how it would look like in a more normal intersection we have in Copenhagen. So we have been focusing a lot on improving the safety for bicyclists, because it's very good for people that they go biking, and it's good for society, but it's also quite unsafe in general compared to other transport modes. And some of the things that we have been improving is, of course, in Denmark we have the blue lines on the streets that is marking where the bicycles are, so the cars are more observant towards the bikes. And then also in the intersection we have implemented in most intersections in Copenhagen now that the bikes will be in front of the cars when they are waiting for the green signal. We can see that in the top left here, that the cars will be standing here and the bikes are like in front of them. So if cars are turning right, then they will be able to see the bikes, and that should avoid some accidents. You can also see it in the top left here where the bikes are in front of the cars behind, and also down here where the cars would be here and the bicyclists would be here. And this has actually improved safety over the years. I think it's been stagnating now, so it's we should improve it even more. But it has been improving the safety in Copenhagen over the past 30 years, to more than a half of what were killed and injured before. Most of these, so these are quite large numbers. Most of them are injured people, not killed people. In Denmark, we have around 200 fatalities in traffic a year, and we are 6 million people. And we just talked about that over lunch the other day, that I think that's in Colombia it's 7 times more fatalities you have. So in Denmark it is quite low, but we are still trying to improve this, of course, and especially with the focus of improving bicycle safety and the interaction with, for example, trucks and heavy cars, because 2 out of 3 road fatalities for bicyclists are happening with the intersections with the trucks. So I wanted to talk a little bit about framework we have, or a collaboration we have in Denmark on how to improve the conditions for bicycle infrastructure. We have something called the Cycle Superhighway Collaboration, which is a unique regional collaboration between the municipalities and the region. Maybe I should give a little bit of background that in Denmark, for planning infrastructure, for example, but also the society in general, we have 3 levels of planning. We have the municipalities on the local level, then we have the region, and then we have the government. We have 98 municipalities in Denmark, we have 5 regions, and then we have the government controlling the whole area, of course. So in the Copenhagen area, we have 27 municipalities, and then the capital region of Denmark, one of the 5 regions. And they have this collaboration of how to implement infrastructure for bicyclists across the entire greater Copenhagen area. Because infrastructure in terms of bicycle lanes and so on is handled by the local level, the municipalities. And that means that there might not be so much coordination between municipalities. And this is then an effort to create more coherent planning of the bicycle infrastructure. So the idea is that they want to create high quality commuter routes, connecting residential areas with study and workplaces in the city center. As we can see in the bottom right, it started around 10 years ago, and they've been improving and increasing the network size over the years, still having plans to increase it even more. But the network you can see to the right, covering, of course, the dense Copenhagen area, but leading all the way out to far suburbs. And you can see the scale here that some of these bicycle paths are like 50 kilometers long. So you can go 50 kilometers on a dedicated path, for example. In terms of whether it makes sense to build this, when we do cost-benefit analysis, then bicycle traffic and infrastructure is actually one of the best investments for society. When we compare to road projects or public transport projects that often have around 3 to 5, maybe 10% of internal rate of return, then this network of routes actually has an internal rate of return of 23%. And most of these effects come from health effects. People that are biking, they are more healthy. It's good for their health, and that has very high contribution for the benefit of society, that people are more healthy. So 77% of these benefits come from these health effects. This is just to say again what I mentioned before, that public transport, road transport, highways, and so on are often, or is in Denmark, planned and constructed by the nation and the regionally anchored institutions. But this with the bicycle traffic is a bit difficult because it's on the local level, and that's why we need this type of regional planning coherence and an organ to actually do that. So this is what they do. Here's a map to the left of all the municipalities in Copenhagen, and they all have a mayor each, but they have this, and they're in charge of traffic safety, developing district areas, local plans, land use, and so on, schools, so on. And then this office for superhighways, they will look into strategy and concept, anchoring implementation of these bicycle routes on the entire regional level. This is how it actually looks, because as I mentioned, we have lots of bicycle routes in the municipalities in Denmark, but many of them are fragmented because it goes through different municipalities, and which have different mayors and different people in charge, different planning horizons, and so on. So what this project is about is to, where we have gaps in the existing infrastructure up here, for example, this is a route of 25 kilometers, and it has good infrastructure in some places, but it's lagging in between. And then the project is here to like fill these gaps with some physical infrastructure implementations. And then what happens is that we end up having a full coherent path going all the way from the far out suburb and into the Copenhagen area. So that is the idea, to have this office that collaborates across all the different municipalities. This is how the super cycle highways look in different contexts. So in the top, we have in the city center, dedicated bicycle paths, for example, in green areas, also going into the dense city areas, crossing traffic and so on. But then also in the rural areas, we have dedicated lanes for bicycle traffic, and then trying to connect these into like a coherent network. I just added some more pictures here that the signs for now you are running on a bicycle highway, and some distances to where the end location of the highway is, and the sign of the super cycle highway is the C on the pavement, and with the guidance on how you continue when you have to cross the streets and so on to get to the destination of the different super cycle highways. So it's taking some of this where we know from road traffic you have lots of guidance, lots of signage, but for bicycles, at least traditionally, there was not so good signage, and it's difficult to know exactly where to go. But then this is part of the identity of the cycle superhighways, that you have signage all the way. Yeah, and as I mentioned, they are quite successful. High increase in number of bicycle users when we implement these things, 52% average increase when upgrading some of these highways, additional users per year. The travel distances are also increasing. The people that use cycle super highways, they travel further distances. And that's something that in Denmark we are focusing on, because we have lots of bicycle users for the short distances in the city, but we want to also increase this to longer distances covering the entire greater Copenhagen area. So this is one of the efforts to make it more easy to travel longer distances for the users, especially now that we also see that people are switching from using traditional bikes to using electric bikes. And with electric bikes, you can travel easier longer distances. And this is one of the infrastructure improvements that can also facilitate this technological advance. Yeah, as we can see, 20% of the users on these cycle superhighways are using e-bikes, and that's way higher than on the normal traditional bicycle paths in Copenhagen. Yeah, of course, we have more people commuting in the summer than in the winter. We have different seasons, which you're not compared to here, but we have a very cold winter in Denmark and lots of rain, lots of wind, lots of snow sometimes. But some people actually bike all year round, and we want to also facilitate that. So also putting focus on when it's snowy, removing the snow from these dedicated cycle superhighways, giving them priority so that people know that they can always use these bike lanes when also in winter times. Yeah. All right. So as I mentioned, internal rate of return of around 20% of extending this network. So the one to the left is the current network that we have in Copenhagen now, and the plans are to the right. So we want to improve it and extend it a lot. And actually building this network to the right has this 20% internal rate of return, which is quite high for infrastructure projects. So, and driven again, as I mentioned, by 77% of health impacts. And at my university, me and some of my colleagues, we've been working on like how to improve these things in a more efficient way. And it would be 20% if just building everything, but of course some areas are better to build than others. And a study that we did looking into what happens when we build new infrastructure, how many people will then use the new infrastructure because it's more attractive. That will increase the bicycle traffic, maybe shift some people from using car to using bike, and so on. And how can we then most efficiently improve the entire network? Working on that, we can actually do it in a more efficient way and build some sections before the others, and then you get an even higher internal rate of return. So that's also something to consider when we build this, like where should we start and where should we end? And how does it affect when we build a new bicycle path in one place? How will it affect the entire network? Yeah. One thing that might be quite interesting, because in Denmark we are very much used to biking. We've done that for many, many years. So does this make sense only in Denmark, or is it also transferable to other countries? We actually did a study on that, not with Colombia, unfortunately. That could be very interesting, but with Germany, which is not as bicycle. They don't have the same bicycle culture in Denmark, so to speak, or at least the same mode share of bicycling. So we looked into comparing the bicycle rates on the local level in different areas, both in Denmark and in Germany, taking into account the urban typology, like urban areas, rural areas. What is the public transport density? Like how good is the public transport system in the different areas? The bicycle infrastructure, a very important variable to take into account. How extensive is it? And also the gradient. Denmark is very, very flat. Our tallest mountain is 182 meters. Very, very flat country. But in Germany, you have mountains. So that's obviously also an important thing to consider in terms of whether bicycle is something that you can actually choose, or it's something that is not very relevant for you. But what we found in this study, which I think is quite interesting also in a Colombian context, is that cycling behavior and the usage of bicycles actually depends more on what we call generalizable variables. So your social demographic information, your like the infrastructure level, like the gradient and so on. And I think that gives a suggestion to, if you just have enough bicycle infrastructure, then you can get quite a lot of bicyclists in your transport network. So that's a quite interesting finding, that is not only about cycling culture. It's actually something that you can do in a city, whatever city it could be. If you just plan it coherently and having sufficient infrastructure and so on, then you can get quite a lot of bicyclists. And I think we see that in Bogota, for example. That in Bogota it's been increasing a lot, and they're also building bicycle infrastructure. We did find some cultural differences, but they were very small. It was way more. There's a stronger bicycle preference in Denmark than in Germany, but it was on a very small scale, and the most important variables were those related to infrastructure and the personal characteristics and so on. Yeah, and that just leads to one thing I wanted to say, is that mode choice is also very strongly related to fulfillment of personal needs. So people choose their bike because they have the infrastructure, but also because they want to fulfill some other needs. I don't know if you're familiar with the Maslow pyramid of needs, that humans want to fulfill different kinds of needs, physiological needs first, then safety, security, love and belonging, relationships, and so on, and then self-esteem and self-identity. And we did a study on this, and we actually found, I'll not go into detail here about this, but it's for bicycling especially, and also to some extent for car traffic. Fulfilling self-identity needs is something that also drives whether you want to use your bike or not. It's part of, you don't only use your bike to go fast from A to B to your university. You also do it because you want to have a bicycle self-identity, you like to do exercise, you want to do exercise during your commute and so on. So that also is something that is important. Yeah. Okay, I will talk a little bit about the integration of public transport and bicycling. So in Denmark, many people, they use the bike in coherence with the public transport system. They bike to the station, or they even bring the bike on the train. What we can see here is that for all trips in the Copenhagen area, 15% of people that use the train system, public transport system, they bike to the station. If they come from their home place, it's actually 25%. So 1 out of 4, they go to the public transport station by bike, and they put the bike at the station, or they bring the bike on the train. And this is what we can see here. Sorry, it's in Danish, but the very red to the left is how many that brings the bike on the train. And the suburban railway, which has 61%, is because it's free to bring your bike on the train. So many people, they use these two modes in connection with each other. They bike to the station, either they park or they bring the bike on the train, and then they can use the bike again at the destination and going to their final destination. I do the same because my university is not located close to a train station, but my house is, my apartment is. So I can bring the bike on the train and then bike the 2 kilometers in the destination to my university. And the suburban trains are organized for this. So this is how it looks in Copenhagen. We have wagons in the train that are dedicated for having bikes on the train, and it's very easy to get in and out on the platforms. The stations are also very good, have good connections to the local street network and bicycle network. On the top left, for example, you can go directly from the platform and out to like a green path where you can bike all the way directly into the platform. And many stations are like that. And some of the super cycle highways are also connected in the same corridors as the train corridors, and you have the bicycle path linking like next to it, and then with entrances to the stations. So you can bike along the way, and then you can take the train some of the way as well. And then we also have, of course, people that bikes to the station, and then they park at the station. You can see here we have the bike parking very close to the train, so you can bike and then park your bike and then take the train. Some other examples. This is the most dense, crowded public transport station in Copenhagen, Nørreport station in the downtown city center. which was transformed a few years ago, and with like lots of bike parking on the street level, as you can see, which is good, but it's also a lot of land use in the city. So I wanted to emphasize that some other countries might be better at this. We don't have that much parking below ground, as for example in Amsterdam and Utrecht and Netherlands in general, where they have these very big underground parking areas where you can bike all the way to the parking lot and then take public transport. This is how it more looks in Denmark. To the right is the metro, where you have underground bicycle parking. It's not used very much, both because the metro is covering the city center where most people walk to the metro station, but also because it's a bit annoying that you have to like carry your bike down with the escalators and then go into this room and then park the bike there. So what people normally do, they use, as I mentioned, want to show that again. The black to the right is that I put my bike in cualquier lugar where there was like a space for it. So this is what obviously happens to the bottom left, that this is not a bicycle parking area, but people just put their bike there because it's convenient. All right. If you have any questions on anything, then you should just shoot and raise your hand, and I'm happy to take questions along the way. At the end, okay, sure. I will talk a little bit about...
Mister, question, sorry to interrupt you. Over here.
There.
Yes. So, hi everyone, my name is David. I study law and economics. And well, first and foremost, thank you for this conference. It's very interesting because we all know, and that this is like the motive of the whole event, that Europe is like an example for us developing countries. But you mentioned something that is very interesting, and it's like the cultural differences between countries. So Europe is always an example. Walkable cities are the dream. But how can a country like Colombia, that has so many different, like a different culture than Denmark and Europe, how can we achieve this in the future? Because it's not only like more sustainable, it's better, it's more convenient, but like we have a very long way. How we can hurry this change and transform our transportation into something sustainable, walkable, and full with bikes and public transportation? How can we achieve that?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's one of my points here so far, and I'll also catch up on that in the end, is about infrastructure. What we could see, that study with the cultural differences, which we wanted to look into, is Denmark like a unique country with a unique bicycle culture? I don't think that's the case. I think if you have infrastructure and you have a planning of this, and bicycle infrastructure is not that expensive. Highways are expensive. Metros are expensive. Bicycle infrastructure is quite cheap in comparison. So I think focusing on planning bicycle infrastructure is something that will go a long way. For public transport, it's a bit more tricky because that's very expensive. Metros are super expensive. So that requires more long-term planning and focusing on what to use your resources on. But for bicycle transport, I think it's doable. And I think that's what we see in Bogota, for example, that they have dedicated bicycle lanes, and that gives quite good results. On my slide, it was like 5-6% that are bicycle share, but I learned today it's like 11% in Bogota. So it's increasing quite a lot. And I think that's also an infrastructure thing, which allows people to actually use it in a more convenient way. I'll talk a little bit about the urban planning of Denmark in the end here. What is it?
Sorry, here.
Okay.
Hello.
Sure.
Sorry for interrupt.
No, sure.
Maybe my question is similar to the last one, but what were the biggest challenges Denmark faced when building this model, and how did they overcome them? Because I asked, like in a city like Barranquilla, we also need to understand how to overcome all these similar obstacles. So I want to know that.
Yeah. That's a good question. So it's very political driven, like what you want to focus on in the infrastructure improvements. And I think over the years, many years ago, Copenhagen was focusing, for example, on really driving the infrastructure improvements for bicycle traffic and so on. I think recently there's been more focus on car traffic, and that has actually declined the bicycle mode share a bit. I don't know if that answers the question. I think it's difficult to answer. Yeah. I'll continue with this, and then we can also wrap up in the end. So the last part of the presentation is like these plans for urban development. And Copenhagen has this old plan that was proposed in 1947, and which guided the entire regional planning and infrastructure planning for like decades and all the way until now. It's called the Finger Plan, Plan de Dedos, I think. Where we have like a hand, and the city center would be like this part of the hand, and then you have the suburban developments radially outside of the city, like through the fingers. And that's why we also have the S-train network covering, so making it easy to live in these finger areas and then go to the city center. This is another way of how it looks. So here we have the rail lines to the right. You can see in each finger there's a rail line, and there's also like a highway for car traffic. But the idea is that you have a concentration of housing, shopping, employment centers, public institutions, and so on in the fingers and in this part of the hand in the city center, and also have it close to public transport stations. And then in between the fingers we have green areas, so that everybody is close to recreational areas at all times. And then we have these reservation areas for transport corridors. And this is just to remind you of how the public transport network in Denmark looks. So it's also built around the fingers and with the dense city areas here. And you have like a line going in just the outskirts of the dense city area. Yeah. And we have this plan. It's being updated along the years, and the most recent one was in 2019, and they're doing an update this year. The idea is that we have this principle for station vicinity areas. In Danish, it's called stationsnærhedsprincippet, that everything should be located close to public transport stations. So it's a framework for the physical planning in the Copenhagen region, and that covers, like, this entire area would cover more than a little bit around 2 million people. And the idea is that you have well-defined areas where you have the public transport stations, and within 600 meters of the station, up to 1,000 with some exceptions in the city center, and up to 1,200 meters outside the city center, that's where you're supposed to do all your urban developments. So when you build new housing, new workplaces that want to build a new office area, they have to be located in those areas, because that will make sure that people actually use public transport and more sustainable transport modes for their commute. So that's the idea that we have been following in Denmark for many, many years. The problem is that there's also exceptions. This is a rule of thumb, and some of the municipalities, they don't have to follow it all the time. They can do exceptions. But this is the general idea, and it was working very well in the beginning. Now we have, as Copenhagen is expanding, we have more urban developments between the fingers, and that gives some problems here, because the public transport network, for example, is constructed for leading traffic from the suburbs into the city center, and not so much on the outskirts. Yeah, this is how it would look like in a land use example from a local municipality in Copenhagen, that they have these stations on the suburban railway network, the red trains I showed before. Then they actually have the light rail that is being built, so they also have stations on the light rail, and then they focus all the urban developments inside these circles. But as you can see, some of them then move around the circle, and they can give exceptions for that. So, yeah. Just an example of not everything is perfect. This was how it looked back when the finger plan, with like streets with lots of bicycle traffic, light rails, and not so much car traffic. This is how it looks today. So we also struggle with some issues in terms of that. Yeah, I think I have 5 more slides where I would like to wrap up. We did a study recently, which is quite interesting, I think, where we looked into like these effects of this urban development around stations and how that influences people's mode choice. And the idea is that also with the finger plan, we should have all the dense urban environments around the public transport stations to facilitate people walking, biking, and using public transport. So if you look into all these different categories of how you can build your city in terms of having high density around stations, having nice public spaces that gives good walkability, it should be safe, of course. It should be varied, because as you walk along the street, if it's nice, you feel that your time is used in a better way. That makes it more pleasant for users, and people will use these streets more. Should have good connections, good pedestrian cyclist orientation, and of course transit design in coherence with the urban development. So what we looked into in the study is that it's very important for people to be located close to these train stations. As you live closer to this train station, you use public transport way more. Perceived safety is very important as well. If the urban design is designed in a good way that facilitates good safety, and that you are feeling pleasant in the areas, then you're more willing to walk, to bike, and to use public transport. And as we can see with this urban development, we see an increased effect of having a nice urban development around these stations, facilitating using the public transport network. And this is even when we control, and it happens for both public transport, for walking and for bicycling, and it's even when controlling for the service of the public transport network. So the urban design actually has a very big impact on also using public transport and walking and biking, so like all these sustainable transport modes. Yeah, and you shouldn't have too much parking areas if you want to have sustainable transport. Yeah, I think that's what I wanted to say. So just to wrap it up on these things, and also on generally, urban development is very important for these for driving sustainable transport. It's very important to have public transport infrastructure and high service frequency. It's very important that you focus your urban planning close to your public transport stations. So every 100 meters counts. You should try to develop very dense areas close to the stations and less further away from the stations. You need safe public transport needs good lighting, human activity. These more varied urban designs rather than just like closed facades that are boring to walk in. Yeah, park and ride. So the key takeaways, I think, is cycling can be, and that's also answering a little bit the question I received just before, that I think cycling can be popular in different contexts. It's not only about culture, it's more about amenities that we found. So that gives, I think, that's nice to know for other cities around the world that want to improve bicycle traffic, that you can actually do that if you focus on the planning and on the infrastructure and making it easy to use and safe to use for all the inhabitants in the city. That also is the case for public transport, as we could see. High-class public transport with good travel times and being located close to that, that's quite important. But I think the overall conclusion is that it needs planning. What we see in the Danish context in terms of the supercycle highways and also the planning of the public transport is that if you want to succeed in this, it's important to have a coherent planning. In Denmark, we are fortunate to have a good public transport network and lots of people that are biking, and integrating these two things, then you can bike when you have a short distance. But if you want to go further away, then you can bike to the station, you can park there, or you can bring the bike on the train and then use the bike also at the destination. And that gives you way more flexibility to travel both short distances and long distances, even without having a car. But this requires coherent planning, both of the infrastructure, but also of the organization of how these things are linked together. That, for example, the public transport agency is considering how to access the station in collaboration with the municipality, and also giving having a rule says, for example, in Danish trains where it's free to bring the bike on the train, that makes it way more accessible for people to travel longer distances, even if you're not located right next to the train station. So yeah, I think that's what I wanted to say. So gracias por su atención, y si tienes algunas preguntas, comentarios. Sí.
Hello.
Please question for...
Sí, algunas preguntas. Sí.
Open question.
Hi.
Hi.
The name is Thomas. I just got curious about something. Back then, at the almost start of the presentation, you talk about the percentage of the choice that the people choose to move, right? And I got curious about the percentage of people walking, not only the people who use bikes, but to the people who decides to walk. So would you say that not only make it infrastructure to let people use bicycles and the security to make people use them would also benefit those who would like to walk?
Yes, I think that's part of the. I think that's part of the local planning. I think so. In Denmark, we have lots of bicycle infrastructure in most streets, both in city center and around the city center. But we also have lots of sidewalks. So I think there's lots of all streets have wide sidewalks and wide bicycle lanes, and those two modes are very complementary. So yes, I think it's something important to consider that. Yeah, and I think some countries, for example, in the US, there's many places where you don't have good sidewalks, and then you cannot really walk, even for short distances. And if the transport like the road network is designed in a way where even a short distance you're required to walk a long distance, then that's not a really good planning of the infrastructure. And that leads you to take the car even though you're only going 500 meters or 1 kilometer to the grocery store. Whereas in Copenhagen, we have sidewalks everywhere, and it's good pedestrian design, like the traffic signals and everything is designed for also taking into account pedestrians. So I think these two things go hand in hand, like bicycle infrastructure and pedestrian infrastructure is something that's very important. And we can see that in most cities, at least in most European cities and also in South America, that for short distances, many people walk. And that's why it's important also to look into pedestrian infrastructure. Yes. Yeah.
Hi, how are you? Here.
Well,
Over here. Hello.
Sorry.
Hi, my name is Arturo. I have a micromobility company called Flotu.
Mm-hmm.
We rent scooters, and we are developing an app for micromobility. And I have some questions. Here in Barranquilla, what we have seen is that people don't like to bike mainly because of the climate. I think that you have a very big difference, but I didn't quite see. I saw the geography, I saw the mountains, like a motive of not using this type of infrastructure. So I think that even though you would have the infrastructure in this city, the climate will be a barrier. What do you think about that?
I do agree to some extent. And I think that's especially true so another thing in Denmark that I didn't mention is that many workplaces, also at my university and many other workplaces, are catering for bicyclists by making showers available, for example, like dressing rooms and so on. So many people, when they commute on bike, they change their clothes and go to shower on the workplace before going to the office. And I think that's a part that has been increasing over the years. I don't want to see most workplaces, but it's very, very common in Denmark that you can do that. And that facilitates that you can, even in a warm climate, on a very hot summer day, or on a very rainy day in Denmark, as you get fully mojado going to work, you can then shower and change your clothes and so on. And that's good for the commute trips. And that's something that you could also implement in Barranquilla. Like if you go to work by bike, then you could have a shower maybe at the workplace or at the university and so on. Of course, some places it's not possible, but in other places it is possible. So that's a possibility to address the commuting trips. I fully agree on leisure trips. If you're going to visit friends or if you're going to a restaurant or something like that in the city center. In Copenhagen, I always bike when I go out for restaurants, to the cinema, to the theater, whatever. In Barranquilla, that would be difficult if it's very, very warm. So for some trips, it's definitely a barrier. But for some trips, it is possible. Like for commuting trips, for example. And commuting trips, I don't know how it is here in Colombia and Barranquilla, but in Denmark, that would be around 30% of all the trips that then you could actually facilitate by these planning things in organizations and companies. But weather is a barrier, and we see it in Denmark as well. I mentioned it on one of the slides that we do see more bicycle traffic in the summer than in the winter. When it's raining, we see more people in public transport. Some of the bus lines that are very, very dense, crowded, they put more buses into the schedule on rainy days because they know more people will use it. So, and we have seen that also in our research that weather effects are dominant in public transport and in bicycle traffic. And the highways are more congested on rainy days and so on. So I don't know if that's a question, but at least for the commuting trips, I see that you can plan your way around it. But for some of the other trips, it's more difficult. Yes. Si hablas lento en español está bien, pero.
Don't worry.
Okay.
Well, my name is Elias, and well, I was checking that other of the barriers that we have here in Colombia, well, taking the example of Bogota, for example, is that people is still scared of being robbed. There is a high amount of bikes that are being robbed, even using the infrastructure that has been built for this. So my question would be, do you have this problem in Denmark, and how do you solve it? Do you think that there should be some kind of social or cultural project around it that we would work on, or is it just solved by the infrastructure?
That's a very good question. To answer, the easy part is, do we have bicycle theft in Denmark? Yes, a lot. I had my bike stolen twice. All of my friends, all my family members have at least tried to have their bike stolen once. So it happens in Denmark a lot as well. I think the difference is that in Denmark we have everybody has insurance. So when my bike is robbed, then I call my insurance company and they give me a new bike, basically. And I understand that that's not the case here. But we have issues with theft as well. I think infrastructure can go a long way, and technology in general. As I mentioned, showed some of the slides on the stations, for example, we have also bike parking that are like locked bike parking. You have to enter with a registration number or something like that. And we can also use like more heavy bike locks, for example. I heard from Bogota that they also are looking into like how to do this at train stations and having like very locked and difficult to get into the bike parking area. So that's one way. But yeah, it's also an issue of, so in Denmark, we have an issue with like lots of people coming to Denmark and then stealing our bikes and taking them away, apparently. So there is a social issue in this. I don't know how to solve that. That's a very, 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 very big question. But I think infrastructure is important. Yeah, and making sure that you can bike and then park your car, park your bike in designated areas. And if it gets more common, I think it's, I don't know, it might be easier. I don't know. But it's a good question. It's something definitely to consider. Yeah. Yes.
Hello, I'm back. So now my question is the following. So there is a social construct, I think, of needing a car. And there are political interests, and economic interests, such as the petroleum industries, which are constantly like driving our politics and development toward more roads, toward more petroleum and those type of things. So how can we change that way of thinking? And what are the strongest arguments in favor of walkable cities alongside public transportation?
Oh, yeah, well, lobby organizations have strong powers. And the car lobby has traditionally had like very strong powers. And so Denmark we're doing well in some cases, but I think in general, we also have the issues. I think I mentioned it very briefly that recent years, bicycle mode share has been increasing in Denmark, and the investment in bicycle infrastructure has also decreased. And I think that's also a part of the lobby organizations of car traffic that wants to build more car infrastructure and so on. So we have the same issue. How to change that? I don't know if it's a cliche to say, but like, I guess everything starts by choosing the politicians that focus on these things. We have more and more focus on sustainability in general, and that also covers transport. And parties that are focusing on driving the green transition and so on. And that also involves the public transport system, and especially the active transport, like for pedestrians and bicyclists. So I think that's a way of changing things. It might take a long time, it might be difficult, but I don't think there's an easy solution.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Jesper. Another conference is scheduled for this 3:30, so we need to finish this presentation. Gracias a todos por haber asistido a esta conferencia. Gracias a Jesper por su magistral presentación y sigan disfrutando de Cátedra Europa. Muchas gracias. El rol, o sea, how this
Solo hay una puerta de salida, por favor.
Chicos, les recordamos que si desean asistir a la charla que continúa, a favor hacer la fila nuevamente.
La infraestructura la hace el sector público, pero si el sector privado que no se involucra. Bueno, y quería eso, pero me dijeron.
Sí, también. ¿Ellos quieren mi presentación o...?
No sé. Esto es tuyo.
Es mío, sí.
No, después de
No van
Explora más contenidos de tu interés. No olvides suscribirte a nuestro canal.